This program is brought to you by SMC Infrastructure, building a better world.
Hello, I'm Alma Angeles. We're moving to the next stage of the pandemic, and as the world resets to the new normal, we find ourselves seeking the right balance between health and livelihood, constantly adjusting the boundaries between liberty and responsibility. Here are tonight's news. The world is on track to reach 10 million coronavirus cases within the next week. That is according to the World Health Organization chief executive. A somber reminder that as research continues into therapeutics and vaccines, utmost efforts are needed now to suppress transmission and save lives. Here are the highlights of the recent virtual conference of the WHO in Geneva.
In the first month of this outbreak, less than 10,000 cases were reported to WHO. In the last months, almost 4 million cases have been reported. We expect to reach a total of 10 million cases within the next week. This is a sober reminder that even as we continue research into vaccines and therapeutics, we have an urgent responsibility to do everything we can with the tools we have now to suppress transmission and save lives.
I would characterize the situation in the Americas in general and in Central and Latin America in general as still evolving, not having reached its peak yet, and likely to result in sustained number of cases and continued deaths in the coming weeks. Really, I don't think anybody wants to go back to population-wide, society-wide lockdowns, but the only way in some circumstances to avoid that now is a very, very, very aggressive investment in our capacity to detect cases, confirm cases, quarantine contacts, and keep our communities on board and willing, able, without coercion, to support clear messaging and clear instructions and requests from government in a trusting environment. I can't stress that enough.
WHO estimates that at the current rate of about 1 million new cases a week, the world needs about 620,000 cubic meters of oxygen a day, which is about 88,000 large cylinders. However, many countries are now experiencing difficulties in obtaining oxygen concentrators. 80% of the market is owned by just few companies, and demand is currently outstripping supply. WHO and the UN partners are working with manufacturers across the world through a variety of private sector networks to buy oxygen concentrators for countries that need them most.
When we look at dexamethasone and we look, it reduces death rates by 1/5 in people who are already on oxygen. That's great, but by itself, it's not a solution. If we look at remdesivir, it reduces the length of illness in a proportion of patients. That's great, but it's not enough. But if we put different therapies together, different interventions together, and we deliver them in a fair and equitable way, then I believe we can do much more. So I think
COVID-19 has killed at least 477,500 people and infected nearly 9.3 million since emerging in China last December, according to a tally from official sources compiled by AFP. Meanwhile, U.S. officials on Wednesday imposed tough measures, including quarantines and stay-at-home advice as the daily coronavirus cases approached record levels after surging across the nation's south and west. Now, Florida marked 5,508 new infections on Tuesday, bringing its total to more than 109,000 confirmed cases and 3,281 deaths. Governor Ron DeSantis said the state was experiencing a real explosion in new cases among younger demographics and a spike in hospitalizations. Take a look.
Particularly with some of the younger folks. I mean, what we're seeing in Florida is really rapid transmission in that 18 to 34 age group. And you're seeing a lot of cases come up. And granted, they weren't being tested at this level a couple months ago, but I also think they're testing positive at a higher and higher rate. So clearly, you have a lot of spread there. I think it's transmitting quicker right now than it did in March and April. So we're going to figure out whether, if there's relationship or what, but you do see a lot of spread to do that. But we advised from the beginning of May, we advise, if you can't social distance, wear the mask, and if you're in face-to-face business. So that message has been very clear. It's been consistent. But ultimately, we've got to trust people to make good decisions.
The average age of new cases in Florida Wednesday was just 33 years, according to the spokeswoman. DeSantis warned that bars and restaurants could lose their alcohol licenses if they don't follow social distancing rules. He also declined to order the statewide mandatory masking policies active in California, Washington State, and North Carolina, where Governor Roy Cooper hit the pause button on easing further restrictions. Miami has implemented its own mandatory mask rules, however. California, the nation's most populous state, also saw a daily record of 7,149 new cases Tuesday to pass 190,000 total. Governor Gavin Newsom warned that a widespread return to old habits is increasing the spread of this virus, but also pointed to record testing levels, and he declined to reimpose restrictions. Take a look.
Our economy is doing so. As many of you know, we have been experiencing a recent increase in the total number of positive cases here in the state of California. I want to just remind people, as I said a moment ago, there's an old adage, continue to do what you've done, you'll get what you've got. We cannot continue to do what we have done over the last number of weeks. Many of us, understandably, developed a little cabin fever. Some, I would argue, have developed a little amnesia. Others have just, frankly, taken down their guard. And I understand that. We're all human. When you're having a barbecue and you want to say, you know what, I miss you, to your neighbors, your friends, as we not only reopen our economy, but we begin to reopen our households, and we begin to go back to our old ways and our old habits. A consequence is we are spreading this virus, and it is incumbent upon us to recognize that as individuals, as communities, as leaders in our own households, our own communities, to recognize that it is our behaviors that are leading to these numbers, and we are putting people's lives at risk.
He also re-emphasized his statewide mandate for residents to wear masks in most situations outside the home as a way to prevent transmitting the virus to others. And the governors of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut issued a travel advisory saying visitors from U.S. states with accelerating COVID-19 infection rates must quarantine for 14 days. The announcement comes as COVID-19 numbers in New York, once the epicenter of the global pandemic, where more than 20,000 people have succumbed to the disease, trend downward while infection rates spike elsewhere. Take a look.
That the rate continues to drop, and that's what keeps me up at night, and I'm sure keeps them up at night. So we have to make sure we're doing everything and we're diligent and our citizens are diligent. We also have to make sure the virus doesn't come in on a plane again. Learn that lesson, been there, done that. So we're announcing today a joint travel advisory. People coming in from states that have a high infection rate must quarantine for 14 days. And we have a calibration for the infection rate, and any state that goes over that infection rate, that state will be subject to the quarantine.
No region in the country has paid a bigger price with the loss of brothers and sisters. We've lost just under 13,000 members of our New Jersey family. New York has paid an enormous price. Connecticut has paid a big price as well, and I can't thank you enough for your partnership, guys. It's taken 14 days, and in self-quarantining. It's the right thing to do. It's the common sense thing to do. It's the responsible thing to do.
But right now we're seeing, places within some of these states where you have a positivity rate of 20, 30, 40%. In many cases, younger people, folks who travel 18 to 35, who are maybe not at risk themselves but are highly infectious. So, working with Phil and Andrew over the last, week or two, we reluctantly came to the conclusion that this is what we've got to do to make sure that our region stays safe and our state stay safe.
The advisory, effective at midnight, applies to travelers from Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Washington, Utah, and Texas, according to New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo said the governor said the advisory was aimed at keeping infection and hospitalization rates in the New York area low as the region slowly reopens businesses and activities. Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont said his state would inform hotels and short-term rentals about the self-quarantine requirements. The advisory marks a stark shift in the nature of the coronavirus spread in the U.S., where just months ago, several states were mandating quarantine for visiting New Yorkers. And Disneyland in California delayed its planned reopening as coronavirus cases climbed in the U.S. state. The resort near Los Angeles, including Disneyland and Disney California Adventure, had planned to welcome visitors back July 17, pending government approval. Take a look. Now, Disney said in a statement that Californian officials would not issue reopening guidelines before July 4, leaving the theme parks insufficient time to restart as proposed. No new reopening date was announced. The postponement leaves the California resort trailing other Disney theme parks. Shanghai Disneyland and Hong Kong Disneyland have already resumed activities. Tokyo Disney is set to reopen July 1, with the Paris and Orlando, Florida parks planning to start up again in mid-July. California, the nation's most populous state, saw a daily record of 7,149 new coronavirus cases Tuesday to pass 190,000 total. Meanwhile, the Eiffel Tower will open on Thursday for the first time since France imposed its coronavirus lockdown in March, though tourists will not be allowed to the top of the Paris landmark until later this summer. Now, journalists from around the world were on hand as about 50 visitors, mainly French, prepared to make the steep climb by stairs to the first two levels, as elevators will remain closed because of social distancing concerns. The statement said ground markings will be put in place to ensure that people keep their distance from one another, with daily cleaning and disinfection of public spaces at the tower. The monument, completed in 1889, receives about 7 million visitors every year, around 3/4 of them from abroad, according to the tower website. France is one of the world's most visited countries, and its tourism industry has taken a hard hit under a lockdown to halt the COVID-19 pandemic, with hotels, restaurants, museums, and even theaters closed for 3 months. These included some of the French capital's most famous landmarks, such as the Louvre Museum, due to reopen on July 6, and the Palace of Versailles, which reopened earlier this month. France lifted restrictions at European borders as of June 15, and the tourism industry hopes that foreign visitors will start pouring in again as the summer season kicks off. The World Health Organization said Europe has also seen a surge of COVID-19 cases since countries began easing restrictions aimed at curbing the spread of the potentially fatal virus. Let's listen in.
Last week, Europe saw an increase in weekly cases for the first time in months. For weeks, I have spoken about the risk of resurgence as countries adjust measures. In several countries across Europe, this risk has now become a reality. 30 countries have seen increases in new cumulative cases over the past 2 weeks. In 11 of these countries, accelerated transmission has led to very significant resurgence that, if left unchecked, will push health systems to the brink once again in Europe.
Now, Dr. Liu did not identify the countries by name nor provide detailed numbers, but German authorities on Tuesday ordered fresh coronavirus lockdowns in 2 districts, the first since easing restrictions and a major setback for hopes of a swift return to normality. The new lockdowns in Gütersloh and neighboring Warendorf in western Germany came after a coronavirus outbreak at a slaughterhouse that has infected more than 1,500 workers. Now, in Portugal, it reimposed restrictions in and around the capital, Lisbon, to check fresh coronavirus outbreaks, prompting fears this summer tourist season will take a major hit. Among new measures being introduced Tuesday in a region of some 2.8 million people are restrictions on gatherings of more than 10 people, 20 in other areas, while cafes and shops must close at 8 p.m. in the capital. In the United Kingdom, the country has begun its human trial of a new vaccine. To tell us more about it and joining us live is Jennifer Ringwood. Hello, Jennifer.
Hi, Alma.
Hi.
I'm sorry, I wanted to do this from the garden to show you that England has sunshine too, but my Wi-Fi signal is not strong enough out there.
I thought I was expecting you to be in the garden, but that's okay. That's good.
Okay, I'll get on with the report. So, as you mentioned, the drug trials have started here. Volunteers have begun immunisation with a new UK coronavirus vaccine. I was listening to the BBC this morning, and the medical correspondent Fergus Walsh. That was probably the most interesting story that I've managed to get hold of. Unfortunately, I've not been able to get other reliable sources, so I'm going to stick with the BBC on this one. So the information I have is that about 300 people will have the vaccine over the coming weeks. This is part of a trial led by Professor Robin Shattuck and his colleagues at the Imperial College in London. So animal testing suggests that the vaccine is safe and it triggers an effective immune response. We've previously reported about the Oxford University, and it already started human drug trials. So you're probably wondering, why is this one new? Why does this one need to be reported on? Well, I mean, yes, there's a lot. There's 120 vaccine programs globally, but this one is different. It's a new approach. With around 120 vaccine programs, the traditional vaccines tend to be based on a weakened or a modified form of the virus or part of it. But the vaccine from the Imperial College is based on a new approach using synthetic strands of genetic code. This is called RNA. My biology days are way back, so I could tell you a little bit about that. That's ribonucleic acid, and that's the unstable form of genetic code. It's a single strand, whereas DNA is just double strand, isn't it? Anyway, that would be injected into the muscle. The RNA self-amplifies, generating copies of itself, and instructs the body's own cells to make copies of a spike protein found on the outside of the virus. This should train the immune system to recognize and fight coronavirus without having to develop the COVID-19 symptoms. So according to Fergus Walsh again, because only a tiny amount of the genetic code is used in the Imperial College vaccine, a little would go a long way. So the Imperial team says that 1 litre of synthetic material will be enough to produce 2 million doses. So just to give you a visual on that, my 2 litre bottle of water here, that would give you around 4 million doses, and that's a huge amount, which is, it's possibly the fastest that would be usable. So if and when it needs to be mass produced, it could be done here in England. So currently, I believe these have been done in America. I'm not an expert, so I'm going to stick with what Fergus Walsh has been saying and try to quote him as directly as I can to make sure that I don't make a mistake. So it seems that the production of a large amount with Imperial College model is potentially the most efficient at the moment. Fergus goes on to say, all clinical trials begin carefully and slowly to reduce safety risks. When the Oxford vaccination began in April, only 2 volunteers were immunised on the first day. Within a week, 100 were being jabbed every day. With the unique nature of the Imperial College vaccine, this means that only 1 volunteer will be immunised on the first day, followed by 3 more every 48 hours. After a week or so, numbers will slowly ramp up. Unlike the Oxford vaccine, which uses 1 dose, volunteers on the Imperial trial will get 2 shots 4 weeks apart. So Professor Shattuck and his team say there are no particular safety concerns with their jab. It's simply the newness of approach which is making them proceed with caution. There are more than 120 coronavirus vaccines in early development across the world, as I've said earlier. Most of these will never go beyond the laboratory. A further 13 are now in clinical trials. There are 5 in China, 3 in the United States, 2 in the UK, as I've mentioned, and 1 each in Australia, Germany and Russia. All the vaccine teams are keen to stress that they are not in a race against each other, but against the virus. If there are to be enough doses to protect the world, several vaccine approaches will need to be successful. So, again, Professor Shattuck said, we've been able to produce a vaccine from scratch and take it to human trials in just a few months. I mean, that's unheard of. If our approach works, and the vaccine provides effective protection against the disease, it could revolutionise how we respond to diseases and breakouts in the future. I think I've misquoted him slightly there, but you get the gist of it. Back to you, Alma.
So, Jennifer, do they anticipate or do they have indicators that show that this could be successful?
Well, it seems that they do. I mean, if we look back at the BBC report, which I feel that is the most reliable source that I've got access to, if we look at Chief Investigator for the study, that's Dr. Pollock, he's added, I wouldn't be working on this trial if I didn't feel cautiously optimistic that we will see a great immune response in our participants. Mm-hmm. The preclinical trials look very promising. This is another thing that I'm quoting him on here. We're getting a naturalized antibody response, which is the immune response you would want to protect from infection. But there's still a long way to go to evaluate this vaccine. The research has been funded by the government, which was 41 million, as well as 5 million from other donations. I've taken, again, most of this is from the BBC, Alma. It's a breaking story, it's quite new, so where I've been looking at other sources, I've not had enough information to go on. It does seem that they find that this is very, very promising and they're hoping for very good results. But again, as people keep saying, it's a marathon, not a sprint, so this will take time.
Yeah. Well, I'm really hoping it would be sooner than later. Thank you so much, Jen, for your updates there in the United Kingdom. Thank you, EBC UK Bureau.
Thank you for having me. I'm Jennifer Ringwood for EBC United Kingdom. We live in interesting times.
The new coronavirus pandemic could hit drug markets just as the 2008 economic crisis did, exacerbating the risks for users, according to the UN Drugs and Crime Agency in a warning. Take a look.
The trend in drug abuse and use has been increasing, where we have 269 million people using drugs, which is an increase of 30% if we compare 2018 to 2008. This is a very alarming increase. Not just the increase is in the amount of people using drugs, but there are more youth, adolescents, children using drugs. And what the report is saying is that what we really need is more regional and international international cooperation and more investment in fighting drug abuse, because we do not want the fact that COVID has been putting pressure on our health facilities, on institutions, on budgets of governments to divert attention, which has already been decreasing in the last few years. We have been seeing decreasing attention and increasing investment in fighting drugs. So with lockdowns, we have seen less trafficking between regions, but we have also seen some change in the routes. So people are moving from land trafficking to maritime routes. In Southeast Asia, it hasn't impacted much, because also we have to remember that lockdowns in some countries were just for a few weeks. So while it has slowed down the trafficking, it has caused also a decrease in prices, because there is more available on the local markets. And this is a risk in and of itself, because when it's cheaper and available in more and bigger quantities, then more people are at risk.
In its 2020 World Drug Report, the agency predicted an overall increase in drug use due to the pandemic, with a shift towards consuming cheaper products and injecting them, which carries greater risks. Border closures and other measures linked to the pandemic have already caused shortages of drugs on the street, leading to higher prices and reduced purity, according to the report. Drug traffickers seem to rely more on maritime routes, such as direct cocaine shipments by sea from South America to Europe, and online trafficking via the dark net, which offers users total anonymity, and shipments by mail might also increase, it added. Now, drug consumption overall is already on the rise, especially in developing countries, according to the report. Eagle News will be right back.
The Metro Rail Transit 7, or MRT-7, is a planned rail and road project from North Avenue, Quezon City to San Jose del Monte, Bulacan, with 14 stations, which can service 650,000 passengers daily. And very soon, the construction of the new Manila International Airport in Bulacan, Bulacan is expected to accommodate 100 million passengers annually and promises to be another significant contribution to progress in the Philippines.
Indian fighter jets roared over a flashpoint Himalayan region Wednesday as part of a show of strength following what military sources say has been a Chinese takeover of contested territory. Now, Chinese forces have also held onto a chunk of land covering several square kilometers at the mouth of Galwan Valley following a deadly brawl there on June 15, according to the Indian military sources. The two sides publicly declared they would pull back following the clash, which left 20 Indian soldiers dead after a battle involving rocks and nail-studded batons. But both countries have maintained troops around the valley, with India deploying more forces and trying to project military might. Now, images taken on Sunday by the U.S. satellite firm Maxar showed trucks and huts at camps on the river near the scene of the fighting. It wasn't clear which side they belonged to. The two countries fought a border war in 1962, but this month's fighting was their deadliest encounter in 53 years. According to Indian military sources, Chinese troops ambushed Indian soldiers and then forced them down a ridge where they had gone to remove a Chinese encroachment. A bilateral accord prevents the use of guns, but the fighting was still fierce with rudimentary weapons. China has in turn accused Indian soldiers of twice crossing the line of actual control, the unofficial boundary, provoking its troops. But the Chinese appear to be sticking to their gains at Galwan and the nearby Pangongcho Lake, Police intelligence and military sources said, and China is now claiming the valley as its own in statements that India has rejected. Japan has scrapped the deployment of a multi-billion-dollar U.S. anti-missile system. The government confirmed today, days after saying the program had been suspended. Interceptors were the Aegis Ashore system were to be placed in 2 regions under the costly and controversial program, but the government reversed course under pressure from local residents concerned about the risks posed by a missile defense system in their backyard. Take a look.
I said we had to cancel the installment of Aegis Ashore. We found out we couldn't control where the booster would fall. And we promised the local community that we will control where the booster goes down. And we found out we are not able to do that. So we couldn't move ahead with this Aegis Ashore project. So had to cancel it. We have been talking with the United States how to improve our ballistic missile defense capability or integrated air missile defense capability. So we are trying to make maximum use of what we have contracted with the United States. How are we going to do that? We still need to look into it. So it doesn't really mean outright cancellation. But still, there's a threat coming from North Korea. They have so many ballistic missiles, and we have experienced that some of them are flying over Japan, and we need to protect the people here. And so we will discuss how we can protect Japan and the people living in Japan from the ballistic missiles. Well, not only the ballistic missiles, some other technology that they are acquiring.
The government had originally guaranteed that interceptor missile gear would not land in residential areas near where the system was based. But last week, when initially announcing that deployment of the system had been suspended, Mr. Kano said maintaining that promise would require a costly and time-consuming hardware upgrade. The Aegis Ashore system, the purchase of which was approved in 2017, was estimated to cost Japan $4.2 billion over 3 decades. However, there have been competing claims about whether initial estimates would fall short of the real cost. The deal to buy the system was seen both as part of attempts by Tokyo to bolster defensive capabilities after North Korean missile launches, as well as a way to foster closer ties with Washington. U.S. President Donald Trump has pushed allies to buy more American products, including military equipment. Japan's armed forces have long been restricted to self-defense, and the country relies heavily on the U.S. under a bilateral security alliance. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said last week his government was committed to considering alternatives to the Aegis Ashore system. Meanwhile, Russians began voting on Thursday in a nationwide ballot on constitutional reforms that could see President Putin remain in power until 2036. Election officials opened polling stations ahead of voting day on July 1st to reduce the risk of overcrowding that could spread coronavirus infections. Masks and disinfectant gels were made available to 110 million voters across 10 time zones. And Russians in Vladivostok in the Far East cast their ballots wearing masks as election officials distributed ballot papers in gloves, according to an AFP journalist. The Kremlin reluctantly postponed the vote scheduled for April 22 as COVID-19 infections increased and officials imposed restrictions to slow the pandemic. President Putin introduced the reforms to the 1993 Constitution in January this year, and they were hastily adopted by both houses of parliament and regional lawmakers. He has insisted that Russians vote on the changes, even though a referendum is not legally required, arguing a plebiscite would give the amendments legitimacy. Experts at state-run pollster Vitizium this week projected that as many as 71% of voters would cast their ballots in favor of the reforms. Yet the vote comes as President Putin is suffering historically low approval ratings over his handling of the virus pandemic and the economy. Meanwhile, people are queuing up for drive-through coronavirus testing in Melbourne as Australia tries to contain the country's only significant outbreak amid fears of a second wave. Now, the outbreak had rattled Australia, which has been rolling back restrictions after successfully curbing the virus spread. Asked about another lockdown, this is what the health minister said.
A family remains an option, but I am hopeful that with this level of testing and this level of awareness that we will be able to control and suppress those cases.
Reconsider travel or don't make plans to travel into these hotspot areas.
Now, Australia's military announced on Thursday it would send 1,000 troops to Melbourne in an effort to help contain the country's only significant coronavirus outbreak over fears of a second wave. Victoria State has seen a spike in COVID-19 cases, recording almost 150 new infections over the past week as new clusters have emerged in Melbourne. On Thursday, authorities recorded at least 37 cases, the highest national total since mid-April. Military personnel are already manning the borders of states that are close to outside visitors, as well as providing planning support to health and emergency management services, including in Victoria. However, the deployment of such a large military contingent to a major Australian city is unprecedented in the coronavirus crisis. It also comes as concern ramps up in Melbourne with additional pop-up testing centers set up in virus hotspots and supermarkets reimposing buying limits amid fears of a return of panic buying. Meanwhile, students in Papua New Guinea have returned to school. Echo Hortaleza Quinola reports from Papua New Guinea.
Papua New Guinea managed to avoid a serious coronavirus outbreak. It might not be a totally COVID-free country, but definitely no one died due to coronavirus.
Although relieved that Papua New Guinea has no recorded death of COVID-19 positive, the government remained concerned that people in this country will still be extra careful and be safe, secure, and strong, and most of all, they should not ignore precautions. Papua New Guinea, which have roughly 9 million people, have been devastated by the impact of this crucial illness because livelihoods are strongly affected by the limited supplies and prices of commodities went up. It also led to job losses with drastic fall of incomes. They have only detected 8 cases of COVID-19 in the last update from the Department of Health. Samples were sent to Australia for testing and all had come back negative. Mystified at the way the virus seems to be spreading in this land where one person in a family circle tested positive, but those living in close proximity with them does not become infected. People are wondering if there is something unusual in this country, or is there something in their biological system that prevents this highly contagious virus from transmitting from one person to another. They also believe that the best cure or medication to treat COVID-19 is to have a strong body immune system. Nowadays, Papua New Guinea is dealing with the widespread of dengue fever, malaria, and tuberculosis. Hospital staff and frontliners are providing proper health services to these sick people. According to 2K Medical Center, one of the leading hospitals in Papua New Guinea, the health of the people in Papua New Guinea is their concern and mission. They provide a new era in healthcare using their advanced hospital equipment. Papua New Guinea government announced also the further extension of state of emergency. However, they have already allowed schools to reopen. The classes suspension due to coronavirus outbreak was already lifted. Students and teachers are back to school provided that they frequently wash their hands, wear face masks and gloves, and strictly observe social distancing. The government also said that school attendance is not compulsory. It is the parents' choice to not bring their children to school if they believe that it is not yet safe to be back in school. Public transports have resumed operation, but with limits on passenger numbers. Inter-province travel, or the so-called domestic flights in several provinces, have resumed, but international flights remain banned.
Papua New Guinea is looking forward to a new day when this virus goes away. They are positive that one day, with God's help, this pandemic, our common enemy, will soon end. Reporting from Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, this is Echo Hortaleza Quinola. We live in interesting times.
The IMF laid out the unprecedented economic devastation caused by the coronavirus pandemic. As the WHO said, it expects the number of global infections to soon hit 10 million and cases surge in the Americas. The International Monetary Fund said that this crisis, like no other, would send the global GDP plunging by 4.9%. Take a look.
Now, these projections imply a cumulative loss to the global economy over 2 years of over $12 trillion from this crisis. The downgrade from April reflects worse than anticipated outcomes in the first half of this year, an expectation of more persistent social distancing into the second half of this year, and damage to supply potential. Compared to our April World Economic Outlook, we are now projecting a deeper recession in 2020 and a slower recovery in 2021. Global output is projected to decline by minus 4.9% in 2020, which is 1.9 percentage points below our April forecast. As countries reopen, the pickup is uneven. On the one hand, pent-up demand is leading to a surge in spending in some sectors like retail. On the other hand, contact-intensive sectors like hospitality, tourism, and travel remain depressed. The labor market has been severely hit and at record speed, and particularly so for lower-income countries, low-income workers, and semi-skilled workers who do not have the option of teleworking. So we are definitely not out of the woods. We have not escaped the great lockdown. Given this tremendous uncertainty, policymakers should remain vigilant and adapt policies as the situation evolves. Substantial joint support from fiscal and monetary policy will need to be continued, especially in countries where inflation is projected to stay low.
Australia's Qantas is cutting 6,000 staff and grounding 100 planes for up to a year in a $10 billion cost-cutting blitz in response to the COVID-19 crisis, according to the airline, and it announced that today. CEO Alan Joy said the 3-year plan to save Australia's flag carrier from the biggest crisis the industry has ever faced, would also see more than half the company's remaining 23,000 staff remain on leave for months. The coronavirus pandemic had already forced Qantas to cancel nearly all its international flights until at least October and slash domestic routes. While domestic travel is beginning to pick up as most Australian regions have successfully contained the pandemic, the country's international borders are expected to remain closed to most passenger traffic until next year. The Philippines said it will investigate links to the 1.9 billion euro Wirecard scandal, adding the European payment provider's ex-chief operating officer may be in the country. The announcement follows the arrest in Germany on Monday of Wirecard's ex-chief executive, Marcus Braun, on suspicion of fraud. Prosecutors accuse him of false accounting and market manipulation in connection with the scandal, which is fast turning into one of Germany's biggest financial frauds. They believe Braun artificially inflated the company's assets and revenues through fake transactions in order to make the company seem financially stronger and more attractive to investors and customers. The assets were supposedly held in trust accounts at 2 Philippine banks to cover risks in trading carried out by third parties on Wirecard's behalf. Philippine Justice Secretary Menardo Guevara said Wednesday it wasn't certain Wirecard actually operated in the country. Still, the country's National Bureau of Investigation and the Anti-Money Laundering Council would investigate individuals allegedly involved in the case, he said. The 2 Philippine banks allegedly involved, BDO and BPI, have denied having a relationship with Wirecard, while the central bank said the money never entered the country's financial system. And Apple temporarily closed 7 stores in the Houston area where 987 new cases of COVID-19 were reported on Wednesday. A dozen other stores had closed last week in Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Arizona. Apple was one of the first companies to shut its stores around the world in March in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the company said it's closely monitoring the COVID-19 situation on a region-by-region basis to make sure it's safe to operate its stores. The electronics company had reopened its U.S. stores in mid-May. Nokia and Ericsson have been chosen as Singapore's main 5G network providers. Telecom operators said leaving Huawei with only a minor role as the Chinese tech giant faces growing U.S. pressure. Huawei has been dogged by allegations of stealing American trade secrets and aiding China's espionage efforts, with Washington pushing countries to bar the company from involvement in their next-generation networks. Huawei has denied ties with the Chinese government. Singtel, one of the city-state's main telecom operators, said Wednesday it had chosen Sweden's Ericsson to build its 5G network after the government gave final approval. A joint venture that includes the country's 2 other major telecom operators, M1 and StarHub, announced it had opted for Nokia to build its main 5G infrastructure. However, both M1 and StarHub said that other firms, including Huawei, could have some involvement in the project. Huawei only won the contract to be a provider for a smaller local network system operated by TPG Telecom, a more minor player. The Southeast Asian city-state tries to maintain good relations with both the U.S. and China, and Information Minister S. Iswaran insisted that no company had been excluded in the selection process. Just days after lockdown ended and European travel restrictions were lifted, many were staying home in the cool Tuesday as a heat wave hit the continent with temperatures touching 40 degrees Celsius. In some areas, the mercury was even seen topping 41 degrees Celsius or 106 degrees Fahrenheit, such as Seville in southern Spain, where people were cooling off in fountains or taking a dip in the Guadalquivir River in the morning. Spain's IMET National Weather Agency said elsewhere in southern and western areas, temperatures have hovered around 40 degrees since Sunday. And by Tuesday, 9 regions were on high alert for the heat, which was expected to last until Thursday. France was also experiencing its first heat wave with temperatures in the mid-30s expected to last until Thursday, according to Meteo France. And Britain was bracing for a flood of visitors to its beaches, with a heat wave expected to last until Friday and temperatures set to climb into the mid-30s in the south and center of the country. Now, South Africa's National Sea Rescue Institute issued a safety warning to bathers and surfers after numerous shark sightings on the southern coastline in recent weeks. Take a look. In sports, marathons in New York and Berlin were canceled on Wednesday due to concerns regarding the coronavirus pandemic, according to organizers, as other races ponder their plans. Now, the New York Roadrunners, after consulting with New York Mayor Bill de Blasio, called off the planned November 1 race, what would have been the 50th edition of the world's largest marathon, with more than 50,000 finishers expected. The running club, organizers of the annual 26.2-mile trek through New York's 5 boroughs, said COVID-19 worries for runners, spectators, volunteers, and staff prompted the decision. Now, this marks the first year the New York race has not been contested since 2012, when Hurricane Sandy wiped out the event. Next year's New York race date was set on or for November 7, 2021. The Berlin Marathon organizers also cited trouble finding an alternate date due to the COVID-19 pandemic and calling off an event that drew 62,000 runners in 2019. In late April, a postponement was announced for the Berlin race, which had been scheduled for September 27, but virus issues forced the event to be scrapped altogether. And finally, in our news, a mysterious object, roughly 800 million light years from Earth, detected using gravitational wave sensors, is either one of the smallest black holes or one of the largest neutron stars so far discovered, according to scientists. Take a look. The Advanced Virgo Detector at the European Gravitational Observatory, or EGO, in Italy, and 2 wave observatories in the U.S. discovered the object last year and calculated it to weigh around 2.6 times our own sun. That places it in the universe's mass gap, referring to the virtually complete lack of observed objects between 2.6 to 5 solar masses. They said the object formed when another unknown body merged with a large black hole around 800 million years ago. That is according to scientists, and in doing so, emitting a huge gravitational wave detectable on Earth. Both neutron stars and black holes form when very massive stars burn through their nuclear fuel and explode in phenomena known as supernovae or nova. Stars with lighter cores tend to form neutron stars. Heavier ones, however, collapse into black holes. whose mass is so condensed its gravity sucks in dust and gas from surrounding galaxies. The team behind the research, published in the Astrophysical Journal Letter, said there were several possible explanations for the object's unique nature. Chief among them is that the original object may have been a relatively small neutron star that was effectively swallowed whole by a black hole. I think of Pac-Man eating a little dot. That is according to Vicky Calogera, a researcher at the LIGO Observatory Network and a professor at Northwestern University. Gravitational waves whose existence was predicted by Albert Einstein transport energy as gravitational radiation, allowing detection equipment to extrapolate the mass of what created them. Since its gravitational wave is proof of its formation, the researchers said the object's discovery questions the existence of the mass gap. And before we close, we leave you with a word of hope. At the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. See you again tomorrow evening. Good night. I'm Alma Angeles. We live in interesting times.
This program was brought to you by SMC Infrastructure, building a better world.